The Sands Casino showroom was electric that June night in 1967. Every seat filled with high rollers and Hollywood royalty. Every martini glass catching the amber stage lights. Every eye fixed on the man who made immortality look like a day job. Dean Martin stood center stage, bow tie loose, cigarette balanced between his fingers like a conductor's baton. And that voice, that impossible velvet voice, wrapped around Everybody Loves Somebody like it was the easiest thing in the world. The room didn't just watch Dean Martin. It worshipped him. He was Las Vegas incarnate, the king of cool who could stumble through a song and still make Frank Sinatra jealous. But 30 minutes later, in the cold concrete hallway behind the counting room, Dean Martin wasn't singing. He was staring down the barrel of a .38 special pressed against his chest by a man whose hands trembled with fury. The casino owner's face was purple, spit flying as he screamed about respect, about money, about how nobody embarrassed him in his own house. The two security guards flanking Dean had gone pale, one with his hand hovering near his own weapon but not daring to draw. The music from the showroom bled through the walls, some poor comedian warming up the crowd for the next act, but here in this narrow hallway, the only sounds were breathing. Heavy, ragged breathing from the man with the gun. Calm, almost bored breathing from Dean. The incident had started over something small. Dean had quietly stopped a rigged blackjack game, placing his own money on the table to cover an elderly regular's losses. No scene. No speeches, just a gentle hand on the dealer's wrist and a whispered, "Let's fix the count, pal." But to the casino owner, it was a public humiliation, a challenge to his authority in front of high rollers who expected the house to always win. And then Dean Martin smiled. Not the stage smile, not the rehearsed grin that sold 1,000,000 records. This was something else, something that came from a place so deep and so quiet that it made the man with the gun hesitate. Dean looked at the weapon, then at the man holding it, and said something that would echo through Las Vegas for the next 60 years. Not a threat. Not a plea. A truth so heavy, so undeniable, that it sucked the violence right out of the room. The owner's hand trembled, the gun lowered, and Dean Martin walked out, not as a celebrity, but as a myth made flesh. That moment revealed that his nonchalance wasn't laziness. It was armor forged in the steel mills of Steubenville, tempered by years of navigating rooms full of sharks who mistook his easy smile for weakness. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, but stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now, let's go back to June 1967, backstage at the Sands. June 1967, and the Sands Casino existed as three separate worlds stacked like a wedding cake made of ambition and cash, each layer more dangerous than the one below. The showroom floor glittered with sequins and cigarette smoke, where tourists and movie stars pretended they were equals for the price of a cover charge. Above that, the gaming floor hummed with darker energy, where money changed hands according to rules that bent just enough to keep the house fed. And at the very top, past velvet ropes and security checkpoints, sat offices where men in expensive suits decided who got to keep dreaming and who woke up broken. This was the Vatican of cool, and Dean Martin understood its hierarchy better than most, because he'd spent 20 years moving between all three levels, watching how power really worked when the cameras weren't rolling. On stage that night, Dean was everything Las Vegas promised the world it could be. He stumbled through opening bars, pretended to forget lyrics, took long pulls from what everyone assumed was whiskey but was actually apple juice, and made 500 people fall in love with the idea that success required no effort at all. His tie hung loose, his hair looked like he'd just rolled out of someone else's bed. And when he missed a note, he laughed with such genuine warmth that the audience laughed with him, not at him. This was the greatest magic trick Dean Martin ever pulled. The magnificent drunk was a character he played with the discipline of a method actor who never broke, not even when the curtain fell. But 20 minutes earlier, in the narrow corridor behind the stage, Dean had been someone else entirely. He'd arrived 90 minutes before curtain, stone sober, spending 45 minutes rehearsing with the band, correcting arrangements, ensuring every musician knew exactly when to follow his seemingly random improvisations. His tuxedo had been pressed to military precision. He'd reviewed the night's guest list, noting which high rollers needed personal attention and which celebrities required careful avoidance. The stumbling drunk on stage was performance art masquerading as carelessness. The casino owner, Carl Hendricks, had built his empire on understanding that entertainers were expensive furniture. You paid them, you displayed them, and when they stopped drawing crowds, you replaced them with newer models. Hendricks carried the education of men who'd helped build Las Vegas on mob money and desert sand, and he wore that legacy like armor. To him, the Sands wasn't a partnership between management and talent, it was a machine, and every person in it served the machine's hunger for profit. He tolerated Dean's star power because it fed the tables, but he never confused tolerance with respect. For months, Dean had been quietly disrupting that machine in ways Hendricks found increasingly intolerable. A cocktail waitress fired for refusing a floor manager's advances found herself rehired after Dean mentioned he'd noticed her absence. A blackjack dealer caught giving honest odds instead of house-favored spreads kept his job when Dean casually suggested the man had integrity worth preserving. A busboy supporting 3 kids discovered an anonymous envelope containing enough cash to cover his son's emergency appendectomy. Nobody could prove Dean was behind these interventions, but everyone knew. In a town where power meant crushing anyone who challenged you, Dean had found a way to protect without confronting, to redistribute dignity in a place built on taking it away. The elderly regular had been coming to the Sands for 7 years, always playing the same blackjack table, always betting modest amounts from his railroad pension. Dean had noticed him months ago, recognized the ritual of belonging more than winning. Tonight, watching from the bar during his break, Dean saw the dealer's hands moving just slightly wrong, saw cards falling in patterns that defied probability, saw the old man's stack shrinking with mathematical certainty. The dealer kept glancing toward the pit boss, receiving tiny nods of approval. Dean understood immediately. Someone upstairs had decided this particular regular had been too lucky for too long. He was watching theft disguised as probability, seeing a man's dignity stripped away one card at a time. Dean didn't announce his intentions. He simply walked over, still in his stage clothes, placed his own chips beside the old man's remaining few, and told the dealer in a voice that carried no threat but permitted no argument, "Let's fix the count, pal. Make it right." The dealer froze. The pit boss went pale. Within 90 seconds, word had traveled up through the hierarchy that Dean Martin had just publicly corrected a house game, had just made the casino look like exactly what it was. Hendricks felt that correction like a slap across his father's ghost. The whispers shot across the floor like electricity. The king of cool had challenged the house. By the time Dean returned to stage for his final set, the owner had already decided that some lessons needed teaching in private, where cameras couldn't reach and witnesses knew better than to remember what they'd seen. Dean closed his show to a standing ovation, bowed with that trademark lazy grace, and walked off stage into applause that followed him like a wave. The crowd filtered toward the gaming floor, wallets open and optimism recharged. And Dean Martin walked down that narrow concrete hallway toward his dressing room, the thunderous applause fading behind him, where Carl Hendricks waited with 2 men whose job descriptions never appeared on any payroll. In a town built on the house always winning, what happens when someone changes the rules? The hallway felt like a tomb carved from concrete and fluorescent light, the kind of place where Las Vegas stripped away its makeup and showed its true face. The buzzing overhead cast everything in sickly yellow, making the walls seem closer than they were, making the air taste of ozone and industrial disinfectant. Beyond the steel door, the crowd noise had faded to a distant murmur, the sound of people still believing in magic while 3 men stood in a space where magic went to die. Carl Hendricks gripped the .38 Special with both hands now, the barrel pressed against Dean Martin's dress shirt right over his heart. The 2 enforcers flanked them like bookends, stone-faced and patient, waiting to see which version of this story they'd need to help disappear. Time had stopped, but Dean Martin had been in rooms like this before. His mind flickered backward without permission, the way it always did when violence revealed its face. Steubenville, 1932, his father Gaetano's barber shop on South 4th Street, where steel workers came for haircuts and numbers runners worked the back room. 10-year-old Dino had swept hair and watched his father navigate the razor's edge between legitimate businessmen and the men who controlled the real economy of a dying steel town. He'd seen collectors come for debts, watched his father take a beating from a man who thought Gaetano was holding out on the numbers take. What stayed with Dean wasn't the violence, it was what came after. His father, face purple with bruises, had refused to beg or break, had simply cleaned the blood from his mouth and reopened the shop. Men who lead with guns. Gaetano had said in his broken English, they already lost the argument. Fear is what they want. Don't give it to them. The lesson had been tattooed into Dean's soul before he could shave. So instead of the panic Hendricks expected, instead of pleading or negotiation, Dean did what he'd been perfecting since Cleveland nightclubs and Hollywood soundstages. He smiled. Not the stage smile, not the drunk's grin, but something quieter and infinitely more dangerous. It was the smile of a man who'd grown up around real violence and understood that most men who pulled guns were hoping they wouldn't have to use them. It was the smile that said, I see you. I understand what you think you need to do, and I'm not going to make it easy by giving you the satisfaction of my fear. The silence stretched like taffy until it should have snapped. Hendricks' breathing was ragged, his face flushed with a fury that owed as much to humiliation as to any financial slight. The gun trembled slightly against Dean's chest. Somewhere far off, a cocktail glass shattered and earned a brief burst of laughter. In this strip of concrete, the world had narrowed to 3 heartbeats and 1 decision. Dean looked down at the weapon, then up into Hendricks' eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same easy warmth he used for love songs, except now it was wrapped around a truth so heavy it made the gun feel like a toy. You can pull that trigger if you want, Dean said quietly, almost conversationally. But understand, you'll be killing the only man in this town who still believes the game should be fair. The words hung in that buzzing fluorescent light like a ghost materializing between them. Dean had just named something Hendricks couldn't afford to acknowledge but couldn't stop knowing. Las Vegas in 1967 was running on borrowed magic, selling dreams to people who needed to believe that luck existed, that the universe occasionally smiled on the little guy, that walking into a casino wasn't just volunteering to be systematically separated from hope. The whole beautiful con required performers like Dean Martin to make it feel glamorous instead of predatory, to wrap the machinery in enough stardust that people forgot they were feeding a beast. Hendricks had expected threats of exposure, promises of mob retaliation, maybe even bravado. He hadn't expected to be diagnosed. Because Dean wasn't threatening to tell the world that Vegas was crooked, everyone already knew that on some level. Dean was threatening something far more terrifying, to stop pretending it wasn't, to stop being the beautiful lie that made the ugly truth palatable. Without Dean Martin making it look magical, the Sands was just another warehouse where desperate people handed over their money to men in expensive suits. The gun began its slow descent, not because Hendricks was afraid of Dean, but because he was afraid of what Vegas would become without him. The owner's hand trembled as the barrel dropped away from Dean's chest, the weight of the weapon suddenly feeling like an anchor dragging him toward a truth he'd spent years avoiding. Dean hadn't threatened exposure, he'd threatened abandonment. And in a town built on illusion, abandonment was the only sin that mattered. Dean straightened his bow tie with fingers that didn't shake, adjusted his cuffs like he was preparing for another set rather than walking away from his own execution. He moved past Hendricks without another word, the owner and his enforcers parting like water around stone. The hallway breathed again. But at the door, Dean paused, his hand on the knob, and spoke without turning around. And that gentleman's money gets returned to his account. Tonight. No threat followed. No consequences outlined. He didn't need them. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like a gavel falling. 43 years later, a former pit boss named Eddie Constanza would sit in a nursing home in Henderson, his hands shaking with age and memory as he told his grandson about the night that changed how the Sands operated. "Nobody saw the gun," Eddie would say, looking past the camera toward windows that showed nothing but desert. "But we all knew." The word went through the staff like electricity. Dean had stood up to Hendricks, and Hendricks had blinked. The next day, the rules changed. Not for everybody, just for him. When Dean was in the building, the games ran cleaner. It was like he'd negotiated a treaty for a country of one. Back in 1967, somewhere between the stage and the street, Dean Martin had forced a return in a town built on taking. But as he poured himself a real drink in the solitude of his dressing room, the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life settled into the silence. In a city that demanded a piece of everyone's soul as admission, what had it cost him to keep his own intact? For most of America, Dean Martin existed inside a whiskey glass, a man who seemed to stumble through immortality with such practiced grace that success looked like an accident waiting to happen. The public mythology was intoxicating, perpetual intoxication, effortless charm, a shrug that could sell 1,000,000 records. But that image was performance art as carefully constructed as his tuxedos, and the ghost of Dino Crecchetti lived beneath it, disciplined to the point of obsession, carrying a sensitivity to suffering that made the drunk persona necessary armor in an industry built on beautiful cruelty. The real Dean woke early, even in Vegas, preferring quiet mornings before the town remembered it was supposed to be loud. He'd have coffee, not booze, and spend 90 minutes reviewing arrangements, studying lighting cues, timing every seemingly spontaneous moment with the precision of a jeweler setting diamonds. People who worked with him learned quickly that the stumbling drunk was theater, show up late or sloppy, and you didn't get asked back. Behind the mask of indifference, he noticed everything, remembered the names of stagehands' children, kept meticulous notes on every musician he'd ever worked with. The man who appeared not to care about anything actually cared about everything, especially the people everyone else looked right through. Those ethics were forged in Steubenville, where young Dino Crecchetti watched his father navigate the gray zone between legitimate commerce and survival. Gaetano's barber shop on South 4th Street served steelworkers who needed haircuts and hope in equal measure. The back room running numbers for men whose paychecks never quite stretched to the next mill whistle. Dean had watched his father take beatings rather than compromise the trust of customers who'd bet their grocery money on dreams that rarely came in. One afternoon when Dean was 12, a collector slammed Gaetano against the mirror for refusing to shave winnings off a widow's bet. After the thugs left, Dean helped pick glass shards from his father's hair while Gaetano cleaned blood from his mouth and prepared to reopen the shop. "You don't bend to men who break others," his father had said quietly. "Money comes and goes. What you stand for, that's all you keep." The lesson lodged so deep that even when Dino shed his name, he kept that sentence. In Hollywood, the costumes changed, but the cruelties felt familiar. Dean watched extras worked 16-hour days without overtime, saw chorus girls fired the moment pregnancy showed, witnessed aging comics who'd paved the way for younger stars get discarded like props that no longer served the production's needs. These weren't accidents or oversights. They were the system working exactly as designed, grinding people down to feed the machine that manufactured dreams. Most stars learned to look away, grateful it wasn't happening to them. Dean took notes and started building a private code, quiet and absolute. Don't humiliate the powerless. Don't steal their dignity. Never let money justify breaking someone's spirit. So he intervened, always quietly, always in ways that couldn't be traced back to sentiment. Medical bills for crew members appeared mysteriously paid. College tuitions for stagehands' children materialized from anonymous donors. When studios tried to cheat performers out of residuals, Dean would mention casually that the accounting seemed off, and somehow the checks would arrive corrected. He never made speeches about fairness. He just quietly redistributed power in an industry designed to concentrate it in as few hands as possible. A former Sands waitress, now in her 80s, would tell her granddaughter about a night in 1965 when exhaustion had driven her to tears in the staff break room. She'd been working double shifts to cover her husband's medical bills, serving drinks with a smile that felt like it might crack her face. Dean had cut his set short without explanation, walked directly into that break room, and pressed his entire evening's tip roll into her hands, easily $2,000. When she tried to refuse, ashamed and confused, he'd closed her fingers around the cash. If they can't win without breaking you, he'd said quietly, they don't deserve to win at all. Then he'd walked back on stage and finished his set like nothing had happened. Within days of the June 1967 gun incident, subtle changes began rippling through the sands: mandatory breaks for dealers during Dean's shows, shorter shifts for waitresses, better treatment from floor managers who suddenly remembered that the people serving drinks were human beings rather than furniture with pulses. In a town where nothing came free, where every concession was negotiated in blood or money, what had Dean Martin bargained away to secure those small mercies for people whose names he'd never forget, but whose faces the casino would replace without hesitation? The gun never existed on paper. No report, no memo, no whispered admission from Carl Hendricks in the quiet corners where casino owners traded war stories over bourbon and bitter memories. Yet within 24 hours of that June night in 1967, something in the sands shifted like a building that had settled a fraction of an inch after an earthquake, imperceptible to tourists clutching their lucky coins, obvious to anyone who lived inside its walls. The predators knew there was a bigger lion in the room now, one who didn't roar but simply refused to move. Dean Martin walked through the casino not with arrogance, but with the quiet, terrifying weight of a man who'd stared down a gun and made the holder blink first. Dean possessed leverage that transcended record sales or television ratings, a gravitational pull that drew the real money to Las Vegas like moths to neon. The high rollers didn't just come to the sands, they came to breathe the same air as Dino, to light their cigarettes in the glow of his manufactured indifference. A Saudi prince who'd lose $100,000 at baccarat without blinking. Oil executives from Texas who treated blackjack tables like business expenses. Hollywood producers who signed deals over martinis while Dean made them feel like they were part of something magical rather than just another transaction in a transactional town. Most stars converted that kind of leverage into bigger paychecks, penthouse suites, and bowls of only green M&Ms. Dean Martin began using it as currency to purchase something Las Vegas rarely sold: basic human dignity for the people who made the magic possible. The demands came quietly, almost casually, delivered in that same easy tone he used for everything from love songs to ordering breakfast. No speeches about workers' rights, no threats delivered in boardrooms filled with cigar smoke and corporate lawyers. Just simple, unmovable boundaries that Hendricks discovered were harder than the concrete foundations beneath the casino. Dean would arrive for sound check and notice a waitress limping from a twisted ankle, still serving drinks because management wouldn't let her go home without losing her shift. He'd find the floor manager with that practiced smile that had disarmed hostile crowds from Cleveland to Hollywood. She needs to rest. Get someone to cover her. Not a request. A condition of performance. When the manager hesitated, Dean would add with perfect calm, "If they're not treated right, I don't go on." He meant it with the same absolute certainty his father had shown in that Steubenville barbershop. One Friday night in August, curtain was scheduled for 9 o'clock, and by 8:45, the showroom was packed with high rollers who'd flown in specifically for Dean's set. But Dean stood backstage, arms crossed, bow tie still loose, refusing to dress while a busboy named Mateo stumbled through the VIP section, feverish and pale, terrified of losing his job if he clocked out early. The floor supervisor was barking orders at the kid, demanding he push through his shift because they were supposedly short-staffed. Dean didn't call the supervisor over. He didn't make a scene. He simply sat down on a stool, lit a cigarette, and signaled the band leader to hold the downbeat. When the stage manager frantically asked about the delay, Dean pointed with his cigarette toward the casino floor. "We're waiting for that kid to get a doctor and a ride home. Full pay for the night. Then we sing." The showroom waited 20 minutes. The casino lost thousands in momentum as restless high rollers wandered toward other tables. But Mateo went home with dignity intact, and Dean went on stage like nothing had happened. The ripple effect spread through the entertainment ecosystem like cracks through ice. Other performers watched from the periphery, some with suspicion, some with amusement, some with a creeping sense of possibility. Frank Sinatra, never one to be outdone, started demanding upgraded health coverage for anyone working his productions. Sammy Davis Jr. inserted similar language into his contracts, better treatment for crew, mandatory breaks for staff during his shows. It became a quiet arms race of decency, stars competing not for bigger dressing rooms but for better conditions for people whose names would never appear on marquees. The Rat Pack's real legacy wasn't the music or the movies. It was the precedent that stars could use their power to protect rather than just to profit. For Hendrix, the calculation was brutally simple and infuriating in equal measure. Dean Martin brought in millions, and replacing him meant losing not just his draw, but the constellation of high rollers who followed him from venue to venue, like planets orbiting a star. The cost of giving Dean what he wanted, better shifts, fair treatment, basic human respect for staff, was a fraction of what it would cost to operate without him. So Hendrix yielded, piece by piece, each concession feeling like a defeat to a man who'd built his empire on the principle that management never bent to talent, but he bent to Dean Martin. And everyone knew it, and that knowledge changed the power dynamics in ways that would outlive both men. The stories became folklore, whispered in break rooms during shift changes, passed from veteran dealers to rookies learning the tables, carried forward through generations of casino workers who'd never seen Dean perform, but knew his name as something other than entertainment. They became a kind of secular scripture in the hidden corners of the Strip, tales of the night the king of cool decided that being cool meant giving a damn. A waitress in the 80s would tell her daughter about the star who'd stood up for staff. A pit boss in the 90s would reference the old rules when pushing back against unfair scheduling. The details blurred and shifted with retelling, but the core remained unshakable. Once upon a time, someone with power had used it to protect people who had none. Decades later, in a glass office high above a modern strip where the old sands once stood, a resort executive would speak off camera, his tie loosened, his voice carrying the weight of institutional memory. "Some of our employee policies trace back farther than the lawyers like to admit," he said, glancing toward windows that showed nothing but corporate towers and sanitized neon. "You hear things from the old-timers, stories about a star who wouldn't let management break the staff. We corporate guys act like we invented compassion because it polls well with focus groups. Truth is, we're just codifying what one guy forced into existence because he had the guts not to go on stage when people were being ground down." Then he paused, looking past the camera toward the desert horizon where legends go to die or become immortal. The haunting question hung in the air like cigarette smoke in an empty showroom. How many of those small mercies, those tiny islands of humanity in an industry built on extraction, led back to one gun pressed against one chest, one line spoken by a man everyone thought was too drunk to care about? Anything beyond his next drink? The answer lived in the silence between official history and whispered memory, in the space where legends do their real work long after the spotlights fade, and the applause becomes just an echo in empty hallways where ghosts still stand their ground. There is a cost to making everything look easy, and for Dean Martin, that bill came due not in the spotlight where millions watched him float through immortality, but in the empty spaces afterward, hotel suites that felt too vast, dressing rooms that echoed with departed laughter, family dinners. That stopped happening because the man everyone wanted to be with had forgotten how to be himself. The swagger the world remembers was real, but it was also armor he couldn't remove without risking complete collapse. Each night, he gave everything to strangers in the dark, then returned to a solitude that grew deeper with every act of anonymous kindness, every quiet stand that nobody was supposed to witness. The fractures in his private life spread like cracks through ice, slow at first, then catastrophic. His marriage to Jean eroded under the weight of a man who could give his whole heart to a desperate stagehand, but struggled to be present for the people who knew him before he became a legend. His children grew up watching their father from the same distance as his audience, close enough to see the performance, never quite reaching the person underneath. They learned to love the idea of Dean Martin while grieving the absence of Dino Crescetti, the man who'd been their father before the world claimed him as its own. Then came March 1987, and the phone call that split his remaining life into before and after. Dean Paul Martin, the golden boy who'd seemed to inherit his father's ease and none of his protective armor, died when his Air National Guard fighter jet disappeared into the San Bernardino Mountains. In that moment, the part of Dino Crescetti that still believed the universe could be fair died alongside the son who'd carried his name. After that, those who worked closest to him noticed the silences growing longer, heavier, like furniture being moved into rooms already too crowded with ghosts. He'd finish shows to thunderous applause, take his bows with that trademark grace, then walk off stage and stare at nothing for 20 minutes. His eyes focused on some middle distance, where grief and memory collided in ways that no amount of charm could navigate. The world remembered the swagger because that's what he'd trained it to see. The crooked grin, the loose-limbed walk, the sense that he floated a few inches above consequence. But the people who stood beside him in the wings, who watched him from 10 feet instead of from the cheap seats, remembered something else entirely. They talked about the way he'd step off stage after the final bow and go utterly still, not looking at the audience or the band, but past everything, as if searching some far corner of the room for a piece of himself he'd left behind years ago. Those silences lasted only seconds, but they contained the entire weight of a life lived as sanctuary for other people's fantasies, while his own needs withered in the shadows. Every quiet stand Dean took, every envelope slipped to a desperate crew member, every whispered demand that someone be treated like a human being instead of disposable machinery, every anonymous intervention that kept families whole, came with a strange kind of isolation welded to it like a shadow. Because heroism without recognition isn't just noble in theory, in practice, it becomes its own kind of prison. Dean couldn't talk about these moments without turning them into publicity, couldn't share the burden without cheapening the gesture, couldn't seek comfort for the weight he carried without destroying the very anonymity that made his interventions possible. So he carried them alone, adding each small act of decency to a ledger no one else was allowed to see. Each entry deepening the gulf between the man who felt everything and the character who appeared to feel nothing. Playing the clown while carrying this integrity created its own brand of brokenness, a fracture that ran so deep it threatened to split him in half. The mask that protected him from the industry's cruelty also trapped him inside a performance that nobody was supposed to see through, even when the man underneath desperately needed someone who could. People loved Dean Martin for not caring, for making success look effortless, for stumbling through genius with a drink in his hand and a shrug that suggested nothing could touch him. But the man underneath cared so deeply it threatened to crack him open, felt every injustice like a personal failure, carried the weight of other people's suffering because his father had taught him that looking away was the only unforgivable sin. A saxophone player named Eddie Constanza, interviewed in a nursing home during his final years, when memory had become both blessing and curse, would tell a story that never made it into the glossy retrospectives or tribute shows. There had been a stagehand in the early 80s, a good man named Tommy who'd gotten in deep with bookies, the kind who didn't negotiate payment plans but sent consequences that left families permanently broken. Dean had heard about it somehow. He always heard about these things, as if desperation carried its own frequency he was tuned to receive. After a show at the Riviera, he'd pulled Tommy aside and handed him an envelope thick enough to clear the debt and start over. No lecture, no conditions, just quiet salvation delivered with the same casual grace he used for everything else. Eddie had been packing his saxophone case nearby, close enough to see Dean's face in the harsh backstage lighting after Tommy walked away, crying with a gratitude that had no words. He just stood there, Eddie would remember, his own eyes wet with the weight of decades, staring at nothing, like he'd just given away a piece of himself he could never get back. He looked like the saddest man in the world. Then he straightened his tie, checked his reflection in a mirror that had seen too much, and walked back toward the casino floor like nothing had touched him. I thought to myself, that's not cool. That's not swagger. That's carrying the world on your shoulders and pretending it weighs nothing. Today, Las Vegas still sells the surface version of Dean Martin with the efficiency of a machine designed to monetize nostalgia. Walk through the themed lounges and souvenir shops, and you'll find the carefully preserved image, the martini glass catching stage lights, the cigarette held like a conductor's baton, the smirk that suggested he was in on a joke the rest of us would never understand. The city packages his laugh, his songs, the way he made immortality look like a day job, because that version is easy to sell, comfortable to consume, safe to remember. What it doesn't market, because it can't monetize complexity, is the deeper stand he took when no one was supposed to be watching. That legacy lives only in secondhand stories, in breakroom folklore passed down through generations of casino workers, in half-remembered favors tucked away in the attic of the town's collective memory like photographs too painful to display, but too precious to discard. And so we return, inevitably, to that buzzing hallway in June 1967, to the moment when Carl Hendricks pressed cold steel against Dean Martin's chest and demanded submission to the natural order of things. In the mind's eye, freeze that frame just as the gun finds its target, just before the words that would haunt Vegas forever. If that trigger had been pulled, what version of Dean Martin would the city have remembered? The charming drunk who stumbled through brilliance? The crooner who made love songs sound like casual conversation? The Rat Pack member who defined cool for a generation that desperately needed to believe success could look effortless? Or would someone, somewhere, have whispered about the other man? The one who stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves, who used his power like a shield instead of a sword, who carried other people's pain because a barber in Steubenville had taught him that integrity was the only thing you got to keep. By not firing, did Hendricks unknowingly preserve not just a legend, but the uneasy conscience of a city built on forgetting? Did that moment of hesitation, that slow lowering of the gun, allow Dean Martin to continue his quiet war against the machinery that ground people down for profit, even as it ground him down in ways no one was supposed to see? The question haunts the empty spaces where the old sands once stood, where ghost stories compete with quarterly reports for the soul of a town that's forgotten how to remember what it cost to build dreams on desert sand and broken backs. Dean Martin walked out of that hallway alive, but the man who emerged was already halfway to becoming a memory, carrying burdens that would follow him into silence and solitude, into a slow retreat from lights that had loved him for all the wrong reasons. And perhaps that is the ultimate definition of cool, not that you don't feel the heat, but that you never let it burn the goodness out of you, even when the cost of that goodness is everything you thought you wanted to keep. Those words, spoken in that fluorescent hallway in 1967, carried a poetry that neither man fully understood in the moment. A diagnosis, a verdict, and a quiet prayer all wrapped into one devastating truth. Dean wasn't begging for his life or negotiating for mercy. He was performing an autopsy of the Las Vegas dream while the patient was still breathing, forcing Carl Hendricks to confront what his city had become and what it stood to lose if the last person willing to believe in its magic stopped pretending it was real. The genius of Dean's response lay not in what he threatened to reveal. Everyone already knew Vegas was crooked, but in what he threatened to withdraw, his faith. Without that fragile belief that the games could be fair, that the little guy might actually win sometimes, the entire enterprise was just machinery grinding hope into profit, and the magic that made people willing to be ground up would evaporate like morning mist in the desert sun. Today's Las Vegas bears almost no resemblance to the sands of 1967, and that transformation owes more to Dean Martin's quiet stands than any corporate mission statement would ever acknowledge. The mob guys in sharkskin suits have been replaced by executives in tailored gray. The backrooms traded for boardrooms with ergonomic chairs and compliance officers. Walk through the massive resort complexes that dominate the Strip now, and you'll find HR departments, employee assistance programs, mandatory breaks written into union contracts, sexual harassment trainings, and wellness programs that would have seemed like science fiction to the waitresses and dealers who worked under Hendricks. The changes are imperfect, often inadequate, sometimes more about liability management than genuine care. But they exist, representing a radical departure from the brutal old days when staff were disposable machinery and management's only obligation was to the bottom line. The direct line between Dean's gun-to-chest moment and today's employee handbooks will never appear in official histories, but it runs through the foundation of modern Vegas like a fault line that shifted everything without anyone quite noticing the earthquake. The legend circulates informally, the way all dangerous truths do when official channels refuse to acknowledge them. In employee cafeterias below billion-dollar resorts, old-timers lean over plastic trays and whisper about the way things used to be, their voices dropping to that reverent tone people reserve for miracles they witnessed but can't quite prove. A gray-haired blackjack dealer tells a 20-year-old trainee about the one guy who could make the bosses blink. A retired cocktail waitress mentions, almost offhand, that when Dean was in the building, nobody dared dock a girl's pay for being 5 minutes late if she'd just come from taking her kid to the doctor. Break rooms become confessionals where veterans tell rookies about the night Dean stood up to management, the details shifting with each retelling but the core remaining unshakable. Occasionally, a documentary will hint at it. A former pit boss will mention Dean had his own way of doing things or he looked out for the little guy. But nobody goes on record with the gun, the hallway, the specific words that changed everything. The story exists in that liminal space between myth and history, too consistent to dismiss but too dangerous to confirm. The ripple effects of Dean's quiet stance can be traced through individual lives like cracks through concrete, invisible until you know where to look. There was Maria Gonzalez, a cocktail waitress in 1968 who kept her job after Dean intervened when management wanted to fire her for missing shifts to care for her dying mother. She worked the sands for another 23 years, raised 3 children who became teachers and nurses, and told each of them about the night a famous man they'd never meet saved their family from collapse. There was Eddie Chin, a stagehand who received a pension after Dean noticed the casino was planning to let him go weeks before he qualified for benefits. Eddie lived to 92, and at his funeral his daughter mentioned in the eulogy that her father always said Dean Martin was the reason she'd been able to attend college. There was Tommy Rizzo, the musician whose gambling debts Dean paid off in 1981, who stayed clean for 34 years afterward and mentored dozens of younger musicians, telling each of them that someone had believed in him when he'd stopped believing in himself. These are the invisible monuments to Dean Martin, built not of neon or marble but of mortgages paid, children educated, and dignity preserved. In 2019, a man named Michael Torres was sorting through his late grandfather's belongings in a Henderson storage unit, the kind of sad archaeology that follows every death. When he found a shoebox filled with memorabilia from his grandfather's years working security at the Sands, ticket stubs, faded photographs, a name tag yellowed with age. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper like something sacred, was a backstage pass from 1969 with Dean Martin's name printed in bold letters. Michael almost threw it away, just another piece of ephemera from a grandfather he'd barely known. But something made him turn it over, and there, written in pencil that had faded to ghost gray, were 7 words that stopped his breath. He made them treat us like people. No signature. No date, just a testimony scratched onto cardboard by someone who needed to remember that dignity had once been possible in a place designed to strip it away. Michael posted a photograph of the pass online, and within hours, dozens of comments appeared from children and grandchildren of Sands employees, each sharing similar stories, anonymous gifts, quiet interventions. The sense that Dean Martin had been fighting a war nobody else knew was happening. That faded backstage pass became the emotional proof of Dean's invisible legacy, archaeological evidence that what seemed like folklore was actually history written in disappearing ink. True immortality doesn't live in the things Vegas can package and sell. Dean's records still spin on turntables and playlists. His films still flicker across late-night channels. His name still glows in themed lounges where imitators croon his hits with varying degrees of success. That's the easy immortality. Soundtracks and syndication deals, nostalgia marketed and monetized. The harder, quieter kind lives in company policies nobody bothers to trace back to origin, in stories passed down through generations of casino workers who'd never seen Dean perform but knew his name as something other than entertainment, in a slightly kinder way of doing business that emerged from his quiet refusal to let the machinery grind people down. His real legacy lives in the muscle memory of an industry that learned, grudgingly and incompletely, that treating people like human beings wasn't just moral, it was necessary for the magic to work. The final reflection on character over celebrity demands we strip away everything we think we know about cool and rebuild the definition from scratch. Dean Martin's true cool wasn't the cigarette balanced between his fingers like a conductor's baton, wasn't the drink that was really apple juice, wasn't the smirk that suggested he was in on a joke the rest of us would never understand. His cool was standing calmly before a gun pressed against his chest, pulse steady, eyes clear, not to save himself, because men raised in Steubenville steel towns understand that some things are worth dying for, but to save the fragile magic of laughter, the possibility that people could come to Vegas and leave with something other than empty pockets and broken spirits, the lives of people whose names would never appear on marquees, but whose dignity mattered just as much as any celebrities. That kind of cool doesn't photograph well, doesn't sell records, doesn't fit neatly into tribute shows or greatest hits compilations, but it changes the world in ways that outlast applause. Somewhere on the Strip today, at this very moment, a server whose feet ache with the weight of a double shift sits down for a mandatory break, grateful for 15 minutes away from demanding tourists and impossible quotas. She closes her eyes, lets her muscles unclench, checks her phone for messages from her daughter, never thinking of Dean Martin when she finally gets to rest her aching feet. She doesn't know that the break she's taking exists partly because a man in a tuxedo once stood in a concrete hallway and refused to let a casino owner reduce human beings to profit margins. She doesn't need to know. But Vegas knows. In its bones, beneath the corporate polish and quarterly earnings reports, beneath the sanitized nostalgia and carefully managed brand identity, the city remembers the man who once told a gunman that without humanity, all he'd ever own was silence. And in a city built on noise, slot machines ringing like mechanical prayers, crowds roaring their desperate hope, music bleeding from every doorway like the soundtrack to someone else's dreams, silence is the one thing that truly haunts. The ghost of what Vegas almost became before Dean Martin smiled at a gun and spoke a truth that still echoes through empty hallways where legends are made and forgotten in equal measure, where the real cool isn't about not caring, but about caring so much you're willing to stand perfectly still while someone decides whether your conscience is worth a bullet.